I just finished importing my MET data into the temporary table data import table, and now what I need to do is transfer the data from the data import table to the verification table. And you'll notice that this form is the same form that you used for the pollutant data. So the first thing I need to do is select the site, and that's step D. So I'm going to select site S46 because that is where my MET sampler is located. And then I select the sampler of INMET. Now I need to work on the field mapping step, and that's where I tell the toolbox what fields to put the data import columns in the data verification table. So I click on the Setup Transfer to Data Verification button, and I get a blank query in Design View. And that's because I have never imported MET data into the toolbox. If I had imported MET data before, it would show the previous field mapping that I had already done. So first I need to get the columns headers from the table data import into the blank query design grid here. And since there are multiple columns that need to be mapped into the correct columns in the data verification table, I'm going to select every column header in the field in the data import table. So I do that by first clicking on the first field below the asterisk in the table data import box in the top panel. So in my example, that is the output ID field. And then what I need to do is use the vertical scroll and scroll to the last column header and table data import. And in my example, that's battery voltage. And what I need to do is shift click. And what I mean by that is I hold down the shift key and press the left mouse button in the battery voltage field, and that selects every column in table data import. So I'll do that. Hold down the shift, and then I'll press my left mouse. So now you'll see that every column header is highlighted or selected. So what I need to do now is click and drag, and I can click anywhere in this pink area that's selected and drag it into the first column in the blank table area. So I click and drag to do that. And you can see that when I do that, the column headers spread out with each in its own column in the query design grid. Remember that the append to row in this table area shows the columns in the data verification table that your data are going to be copied into. So for my particular example, the toolbox guessed that the year column from the data import table should be copied into the year column in the data verification table. And the only reason the toolbox makes this guess is because the column names in the data import table and the data verification table are the same. If the toolbox makes a guess like this, you should always verify in your new import.txt file that this guess is correct. For example, in this particular experience, the year column really should contain only year values. So I'm going to go back into my new import.txt file and make sure the year column only contains year values. So if I go into the Tribal Data Toolbox folder and open up my new import.txt file and take a look at the year field, so that's the second column, you'll see that there is only years in that field. So the toolbox guessed this one correctly. So back in the toolbox, notice the append to row is blank for all of my other fields. That means if I want to copy the data in those columns into the data verification table, I need to tell the toolbox what column and the data verification table to match to. Remember that there might be some columns in the data import table that you do not want to copy into the data verification table. In this particular example, I don't think the output ID or the battery voltage columns have relevant columns in the data verification table, but I'm going to take a look real quick at my new import text file again and make sure that that output ID field doesn't have anything in it that I need. I'm going to take a quick look at that. So it looks like the output ID field is just 182 and repeating. So it doesn't look like that contains any useful information for me. So I am not going to select anything in the append to row for that output ID column. I'm also going to leave the append to row blank for my battery voltage because I don't need that in the toolbox either. But I do want to copy the other columns into the data verification table, and for those fields I need to tell the toolbox what column in the data verification table to map to. So I'm going to start by clicking in the append to row of the first column header that I need to map. So I'm going to skip over output ID because I don't want that one. And then I'm going to click in the append to row for serial date. Then I click in the drop down arrow to see the list of columns that are in the data verification table. And according to the SOP, if date values are in the serial date format, then I need to map to the column of Julian date. So I need to find that Julian date column for the verification table, and it's right here. Note that there is a vertical scroll bar here if you need to see the other fields that are in the data verification table. So I'll select Julian date. And then I'm going to go ahead and click in the append to row for the next column that I need to copy into the verification table, and that's the time column. And then I click on the drop down arrow there. And also, according to the SOP, I need to map the time column to the hour column header. And the reason I need to do that is because my times aren't in a common time format that the toolbox recognizes because they don't have colons in them. And if my times don't have colons in them, I need to map that to the hour field. And that's something I found out by reading the SOP for importing continuous data. So go ahead and map that to the hour field. And I continue this field mapping for the other columns, which are my met parameters. So wind speed, I click in the drop down and find wind speed. Precipitation, looks like I have to use the scroll bar to find precipitation. There it is. Percent relative humidity is relative humidity, and temperature is ambient temperature. Like I said, I'm not going to copy the data from the battery voltage column in data import into data verification, so I leave the append to column blank for that. So now my fields are all mapped. All of the fields that I want to copy into the verification table are correctly mapped. So what I need to do next is save the query, and I can do that either by going to File, Save, or the easier option is to use the little icon that looks like a computer disk. So I'm going to click on that to save this query. And now I can close the query by clicking on the lower X button. And that takes me back to the transfer to verification table form. And if I was to import another net data file after this import, that mapping would already be done for me. And all I would have to do is click on the Setup Transfer to Data Verification button just to confirm that the field mapping was correct. So I'm going to proceed with the next step, and that's F, transfer to data verification from the data import. That's step F. So I'll click on this button, and it tells me I'm about to run an append query. That's what I want because I'm adding records to the table. So I click yes, and it tells me I'm about to append 336 rows. I confirm from my database logbook that there were 336 rows in the new import.txt file, and since those numbers match, I'm good to go. So I click yes, and now the data have been transferred to the second table in the pipeline, the data verification table. And the next step is to look at the data in the data verification table. And I can do that by clicking on the Inspect Data Verification Table, which is step G. Go ahead and do that, and that opens up the data verification table. Now you'll notice that there's only some of the fields that are filled in, and these are the fields that we map to. And if we scroll to the right, we can see all of the met parameters have been filled in. And I just want to confirm that there were 4 met parameters in my new import.txt file, and that is wind speed, precipitation, relative humidity, and temperature. And I want to make sure that each of those columns is filled in. So wind speed, precipitation, relative humidity, and ambient temperature are all filled in. I also want to confirm that my precipitation values, that I have some non-zero precipitation values. I'm going to scroll down to make sure that that is the case. And yes, it is. And that is good because if I hadn't made that correction in my new import.txt file of adding the decimal point after the 0 for the first record of the precipitation, then these might not have been in there. So I want to confirm that I do have decimal points in some of my precipitation values. And the other thing I want to do is just scroll through the data and make sure I don't see anything weird like blank rows or perhaps symbols in my data or anything funny. And it all looks good to me. So I can close the data verification table by clicking on the lower X button. I continue by clicking on the Update Site and Sampler ID button, and that begins the process process of the toolbox filling in some of those fields. So I click yes when it tells me it's going to run an update query. And 336 rows, I confirm this is the same number that was in my database logbook as the number of rows in the new import.txt file. I click yes, and now I click on the view dates and times button. My data are now sorted in ascending order. So the first date and time is 8/8/2013 at 8 in the morning, and I checked in my database logbook to make sure that matches the time and date that I recorded for this data set, and it does. And I scroll down, and the last date is 8/22 at 7 in the morning, and that also matches what is recorded in my database logbook. And also notice that the toolbox did a conversion here and converted the Julian date to standard format of the date. So I can close this query by clicking on the lower X button, and that takes me back to the form. And the next step is the sampling end time to start time correction. Keep in mind this is a potential step. You might not do this step if your times in your data file are actually already start times. You do not want to do this step. In my example, I know from my MetStation software manual that my times are start times, so I am going to skip this step, and I record in my database logbook to skip step J, the sampling end time start time correction for my Met data files. So now I have two options here: continue to import and qualify pollutant concentrations, which is the button we clicked on for our ozone data and our PM 2.5 data, and there's the continue to import and qualify Met data. And since I am now working with Met data, we get to click on this button and open up a brand new and exciting form. So I'll click on that button, and this new form opens up.